My name's Kara Van Malssen. I work at a company called Audiovisual Preservation Solutions in New York City. My focus is largely on video preservation, digital video preservation especially, and digital asset management for video collections. Video is really challenging from a preservation perspective, especially when you're coming from a traditional library and archives background, because video just presents so much more complexity than most other kinds of digital objects that you might be responsible for preserving. So a TIFF file, a TIFF image file is going to be a fairly small, self-descriptive and contained object, whereas a digital video file is going to be very large, very complex, not very self-descriptive. So to a lot of people it's intimidating. There's also a lot less information available on video preservation than there has been for other kinds of digital objects, for text or image or even audio is much further along in terms of best practice and standardization than video is. The complexity of digital video is really important to understand when you're talking about preservation, because not only when we think about preservation, we're often concerned about file format, longevity. So in a complex object like a digital video file, it's not just the file format, which is the container format, which we need to worry about preserving, but also the codecs, which are used to play back the audio and video tracks contained within it. So each of those codecs really are a piece of software that encoded the file to create the tracks. So preservation-wise, we have to be thinking about really multiple file formats when we're talking about one digital video object. So the codec is directly responsible for the size of the file, actually, because that is what creates the compression. So each codec is using a specific compression algorithm in order to reduce the file size. We do that because video is inherently large in terms of data. It's going to produce a very large file. And so in order to transmit and store digital video, we use compression, so we have codecs to generate that compression and, to facilitate a much easier transmission. So over the web, we need that to be fairly compressed, but also look good. So we use sophisticated codecs that reduce the file by a lot, but also still look visually pleasing to the eye. So yeah, the codec is directly responsible for that compression. When we're talking about born digital video that's shot by, when you're shooting using a camera that shoots directly to a hard disk, for example, or even a digital tape format, that video is born compressed. There is already encoding happening.
So when you think about the kind of camera that you're going to use to shoot digital video, it's probably these days going to be something that's hard disk based. It's going to shoot your video, a digital video, directly to some kind of hard disk format, like or solid state card or something like that. And so that video is never going to tape. That's an important thing to keep in mind. It doesn't have really any physical manifestation. Also important to keep in mind is that the video is born compressed. So you're making some decision at the point of creation by choosing the camera or choosing settings on the camera, if you have options, about the kind of compression algorithm that you're using, and to what extent the compression will be, whether that will be resulting in a larger file or a smaller file. So when you think about it, in a digital world, and especially with digital video, preservation really begins at the point of creation. You have to think about the choices that you're making in terms of camera selection and settings on that camera and how that'll impact the longevity of the digital file you're creating. So let me give you an example. If you're shooting on something that produces a very standard file format using very standard, widely supported and documented codecs, you're making pretty sound decisions, preservation decisions, whether or not you realize it. At the same time, if you choose something that's more like a highly proprietary system that shoots to a highly proprietary file format, the sustainability of that format is much less likely. We have to assume that potentially that the company that creates that camera may evolve its technology. The file formats could change. The company could go out of business, for all we know. So the choice of camera or camera settings that you make should keep in mind the longevity concern. And so going with something that's very standard, widely documented, open source-ish, an open standard is the best approach. So there's a resource that you can look at when you're thinking about file formats, which is the Library of Congress Sustainability of File Formats. And they establish 7 criteria to evaluate when thinking about the longevity of a file format, which includes things like transparency, documentation, wide adoption, and things like that.
So when you're shooting digital video, the camera original, we have to think about this in the same way we did with analog. There is an original, and it was the source that came from your camera. And that is the authentic file that's actually got the highest quality, the highest integrity that you do want to preserve. So when you're thinking about your workflows from that point on, after you've shot your video, you do want to think about maintaining the authenticity of that original. So when you're editing, for instance, you move from shooting video to editing video. So a lot of times people will do what we call transcode, which is changing from one encoding format to another. So we transcode video to a file format that's friendly to the editing system. So Final Cut Pro, a lot of times people use ProRes because that's a very natively friendly editing format for Final Cut users. What you very often see in a Final Cut workflow is the editor will actually take the file and transcode it to ProRes for editing. Now, when they finish their edit, they'll often export out into ProRes as well. And so an archive may find that they're getting a file format like that. Now, there's a couple of things that could be concerning here. One is that, did they maintain that the original specifications of the file, of the native source file that you shot are actually really important. So for instance, things like the bit rate, how many bits per second, for instance. We often look at this in megabits per second or kilobits per second. Things like the color space. The encoding may come back into play as well if the editor chooses to not transcode, for instance. You may want to just look at that. But I would always make sure that you're targeting your original as the native file that you want to ensure preservation of. What we do want to think about is creating some kind of tiered model where you have your high resolution copies, and those may be your source files if you're maintaining the original, which you may want to do. It may be some kind of normalized preservation master file format, so something that you've determined internally in your organization or for yourself that this is a file format you're comfortable with. It gives you the kind of quality that you're looking for. It's extremely high in resolution and quality, but maybe isn't as complex as that source media was. So it's something that's easier to manage. But oftentimes your preservation master is your source master, so you want to maintain that. But then you create something that's like a working copy, or sometimes it's referred to as a mezzanine copy. And this is a kind of file format which is high enough resolution that you could create any imaginable derivative from it to serve any kind of platform that you need to distribute to. So whether that's to DVD or to the web, or even to broadcast, if that's one of the mediums that you're going to be distributing for. So you want to make sure that that mezzanine serves your access needs. And then from there, you can really use that as your working copy. It's smaller than your original, it's lightweight, it's not as processor intensive, and you can use it to create any number of derivatives, which you don't really have to store necessarily. So managing the preservation master in terms of keeping it as your as the master and keeping multiple copies of that in geographically separate places, but then keeping your mezzanine copy as well, so that you can use that for editing and derivative creation purposes. Obsolescence is always something we have to be concerned about with video, and we've been concerned about that since the invention of video. So we had 2-inch quad, clearly obsolete today. We moved to 1-inch, things like U-matic, Beta SP, even Digi-Beta have gone the way of obsolescence. So it's always been in the practice of people managing video collections to be cognizant of those kinds of technological changes that cause video to become obsolete. When we get into digital video, it does become quite complex because we do have that file format and codec kind of structure, so we have to be thinking about multiple formats for one, potentially for one file. So it's quite daunting. We think that it's very scary that all of this is going to go obsolete, or and you've probably had this experience where you go to play back a file and it says cannot find the codec, or something like that, or it just won't open at all because it's not recognized as a movie file. So there are things going on there where the software doesn't have what it needs to play back your file, and that's kind of what we have to keep in mind. Is like that's what's going to happen when the files go obsolete. But at the same time, what we're finding is that the standard file formats are not going obsolete as quickly as we might have anticipated, maybe even 5 or 10 years ago. So we've always got to keep in mind the potential for migration, so the need to move from one file format to the next. And when we do migrate, we always want to be able to maintain the quality of the original during the migration. We don't want to have loss. But it's inevitable because we're talking about born digital video, we're talking about born compressed video. And if we perform a migration, the new codec that is using to compress the video is going to be most likely a different algorithm than the last. And so that change of compression algorithm generates artifacts. And after a few generations, that can become visible. So that's our concern when we're talking about obsolescence. We don't want to have loss. We want to make sure that the video is still, authentic and represents the original. But it's inevitable that that might happen. These complex video files, right? We keep saying it's so complex, and you need to understand them. Well, how do you understand the files that you have, and the technical specifications of all these files, and what are these codecs? The best way to do that is to extract technical metadata that already exists within the files. The files are pretty self-descriptive. They need to know what they are in order for software to play them back. And so you can actually extract that information from the file and store that as your own technical metadata. So as I mentioned in my article on video preservation for the Oral History in the Digital Age project, there are tools that are free and open source that you can use to extract technical metadata from files, and then you can take that and use that as part of your metadata that you're collecting to help you manage the files over the long term. We're at a point in history where it's fantastic because we can create video so easily, and the good news is that video production is we're seeing a trend towards more standardization in terms of technologies, even though we're seeing also that there's still so many options out there and the landscape is very complex. But I think that we are at it's a very exciting time.